A janitor solved the million-dollar math problem. A rich boy stole the credit. And in one night, the lie collapsed before the world. They said Harvard's walls were built from stone, but in truth, they were built from silence. Night silence. Library silence. The kind that presses against the ribs until you feel small enough to vanish inside it. In that silence walked Ethan Cole. 22 years old, skin browned by years of labor, shoulders bent under an old janitor's jacket. He was a shadow among the carved pillars of Widener Library. His job was to clean the marble floors where scholars had walked, to sweep away chalk dust left behind by professors whose names carried weight in journals and conferences. Ethan's hands smelled of bleach, but his eyes never left the blackboards. That night, as winter pressed its cold nose against the windows, the great hall was empty except for him. He pushed his mop across the tiled floor, humming faintly to himself, when his gaze rose and froze. On the enormous slate board, a problem sprawled like an ancient riddle. Symbols, integrals, a fragment of a proof about prime distribution, an echo of the Riemann hypothesis, the holy grail of number theory. Students had been dared to chip away at it. Professors had left it there, half like a challenge, half like a warning. Do not touch what you cannot comprehend. But Ethan could not help himself. The chalk lines seemed alive, whispering in rhythms only he could hear. He saw in them not just numbers, but the pattern of life itself, the way wheat stalks bent in the wind on his mother's tiny farm, the way raindrops scattered across broken shingles, the pulse of a world hidden inside equations. He set the mop aside. His hand trembled, but not with fear, with hunger. He picked up a fragment of chalk left near the board, white as bone. Slowly, carefully, he wrote a line beneath the professor's scrawl, then another. His handwriting was rough, uneven, but the logic burned with clarity. For a moment, he forgot the world. He forgot the uniform on his back, the sting of being the janitor nobody noticed. He forgot rent overdue, court summons tucked in his locker. All that existed was the flow of primes, the melody of numbers opening like a field at harvest. Then, footsteps. Ethan dropped the chalk, heart hammering. He grabbed his mop, wiping sweat across his brow as if nothing had happened. The door creaked open, but it was only the wind. He exhaled, shoulders shaking, and returned to work. But the board still glowed in his mind. He could not leave it alone. At 2 a.m, in the narrow bathroom of his rented room, Ethan stared into the cracked mirror. He had taken a stub of soapstone chalk from the library. Now he used the mirror as a board, writing, erasing with a damp rag, starting again. Mist rose from the old radiator, curling around his face as equations spilled out. There, in that small room, the janitor became what no one imagined, a mathematician. Meanwhile, across campus, another figure stared at the same board. Richard Hale, the golden son of a real estate empire, leaned against the polished oak frame. Perfect hair, tailored coat, the careless smile of someone who never had to worry about rent or supper. He had arrived late, wine still on his breath, intending only to glance at the impossible puzzle the professors had posted. But then he saw it. Faint chalk lines below the original problem. Lines that did not belong to any lecture, lines written with an awkward but astonishing hand. He squinted, and something in his chest tightened. Whoever had written this had cracked open the first lock on the Riemann gate. Richard's lips parted. This could change everything. His father never saw him as more than a spoiled boy wasting tuition money. Professors rolled their eyes at his arrogance. But here, on this board, was salvation. If he could finish this proof or claim it, he would not just be the rich boy with a last name. He would be Hale the genius. The idea took root like a poison vine. Back in his room, Ethan collapsed into bed, exhausted. Equations danced in his mind until sleep claimed him. He dreamed of fields of wheat turning into spirals of numbers, of chalk dust rising like constellations. He dreamed of belonging, for once, to the world of those who solved the unsolvable. But fate was already shifting. The next morning, before classes began, Richard returned to the board. He copied down the mysterious lines into his leather notebook. He practiced rewriting them in his own hand, smoothing their rough edges, adding flourishes. By the time students filled the hall, Richard stood before the board like a king before his throne, ready to claim what was not his. Gasps filled the room as he revealed the continuation of the proof. Whispers surged. The Hale boy solved it. The heir to billions is also a genius. Professors leaned forward, dazzled by the elegance, blind to the theft. Cameras snapped. A star was born. And Ethan Cole, janitor of Harvard, swept dust from a corridor no one noticed, his fingers still tingling from the chalk that would never bear his name. Thus began the war of silence, between a boy of privilege willing to steal eternity and a boy of shadows who had touched infinity with his bare hands. Morning in Cambridge was not gentle. It struck the windows of Harvard like cold fists of light, exposing every flaw in the stone, every crack in the glass. Students hurried with steaming coffee, laptops slung across their shoulders, voices rising in debate about proofs and deadlines. Among them walked Richard Hale, polished like a blade, his leather shoes tapping against the marble with deliberate arrogance. He had not slept. His notebook, heavy with copied chalk lines, sat inside his satchel. He replayed the scene in his head. The board, the discovery, the gasps of the crowd. For the first time, he felt like more than his father's son. He felt chosen. But a voice gnawed inside him. Someone wrote those lines before you. Someone saw the door first. That voice he buried beneath a practiced smile. Ethan Cole was invisible as always. He pushed his mop bucket down the east corridor, shoulders hunched, eyes weary from a night spent writing on mirrors. He heard the whispers already, how the Hale boy cracked the unsolvable. Students buzzed as though a god had walked among them. Ethan kept his head low, but inside, his chest was burning. When he reached the lecture hall, he paused. The board was clean, too clean. The faint chalk smudges where he had written were gone, erased as if he had never touched them. Instead, fresh, elegant writing gleamed, the same steps he had taken, but rewritten in Richard Hale's steady hand. The world tilted beneath him. His mop clattered to the ground. For a long moment he stood there, stunned, a ghost watching his own work paraded in another man's skin. Richard entered then, carrying himself with the careless ease of a victor. He noticed Ethan by the board and slowed. Their eyes met, the privileged heir and the forgotten janitor. "You like what you see?" Richard asked, voice low, almost mocking. Ethan swallowed. "Those steps. They weren't yours." Richard's smile widened, cruel and amused. "Maybe not at first. But tell me, Cole, who do you think the world will believe? The billionaire's son who's always in these halls, or the janitor with bleach on his sleeves?" Ethan's fists tightened. "Truth doesn't care about last names." "Truth?" Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Truth is, whatever people applaud. Yesterday they applauded me. Today, the professors are calling me a prodigy. Tomorrow the newspapers will too. And you—" His gaze flicked down to Ethan's mop. "You'll still be cleaning chalk dust." Ethan felt the words pierce deeper than fists. He wanted to shout, to drag the notebook from Richard's bag and hold it up for the world. But he knew He had no witness, no power, nothing but a heart that beat faster each time numbers aligned in his mind. Richard leaned closer, the scent of cologne mixing with arrogance. Listen carefully, Janitor. Stay quiet. Keep pushing your bucket. If you try to speak, no one will hear you. And if somehow they do, my father's lawyers will silence you before you take your next step. The words hung heavy in the air. That night, Ethan sat alone in his cramped room. The radiator hissed. His notebook lay open on the floor. Pages filled with equations no one would ever know were his. He touched the ink with trembling fingers. Every line was his blood, his breath. And now another man had stolen it, turned it into gold. He stared at himself in the cracked mirror, whispered, "Why did I even touch that chalk?" Yet beneath the despair, another voice stirred. Not the voice of defeat, but of defiance. The next day, Ethan returned to the hall. The board displayed yet another fragment of the unsolved problem. Set as a challenge by the professors. Students gathered, waiting for Richard to dazzle again. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He set down his mop. His hand, steady despite the tremor inside, lifted a piece of chalk. Before anyone noticed, he began writing. His lines spilled fast, sure, alive. For a moment, silence filled the corridor as students turned, puzzled. Richard arrived just then. His eyes darkened at the sight. In 2 strides, he was beside Ethan, voice sharp as broken glass. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Ethan turned, meeting his gaze. "Working." "Working," Richard hissed. "This isn't your job. Your job is the floor, the mop, the trash, not the board." "I don't need permission to think." A ripple passed through the students watching. Some smirked, thinking it a joke. Others whispered uneasily. Richard's jaw clenched. He stepped closer, whispering so only Ethan could hear. "One more line, and I'll ruin you. You have no idea how small you are compared to me." Ethan hesitated. The chalk in his hand felt heavier than stone. But inside, the fire burned hotter. He drew another line anyway. The sound was soft, but it was defiance made flesh. The crowd laughed, some jeering at the janitor's audacity. Richard forced a grin, but his eyes betrayed fury. He snatched the chalk from Ethan's hand, wiped the board half clean with his sleeve, and declared loudly, "Sorry about the mess, everyone, bye. Just the janitor scribbling nonsense." Laughter roared. Ethan stood frozen, shame crawling up his neck like fire. He bent to pick up his mop, heart pounding, face burning. But as he left the hall, he noticed something. A single line he had written, still faintly visible beneath the smear, a fragment of proof that even Richard hadn't dared to erase. And Ethan knew, no matter how deep the shadows, truth had a way of surviving. That night he returned to his mirror. His hand ached, but he wrote again. Not for professors, not for applause, but for himself, for the rhythm of numbers that belonged to him alone. And somewhere across campus, Richard Hale practiced his smile in front of another mirror, rehearsing the face of a genius that was never his. The war had begun. The next days unfolded like theater. Harvard awoke to headlines. Newspapers, journals, even late-night talk shows began whispering a single name, Richard Hale. The heir who solved the unsolvable. Prodigy of primes. The golden boy who cracked the gates of Riemann. Photographers chased him between classes. His professors held out hands now eager to be shaken. Applause followed him like a loyal dog. Richard bathed in it. He wore suits sharper than knives, recited fragments of the proof with rehearsed confidence, and watched the admiration in the eyes of those who had once mocked him as a spoiled dilettante. At dinners, deans raised glasses in his honor. Even his father, usually cold and dismissive, sent a message that began with the words Richard had hungered for all his life. "Son, I'm proud of you." But in the silence after applause, Richard felt the faint ghost of chalk lines he had not drawn. Ethan Cole, meanwhile, was nowhere in those headlines. Each morning he returned to his shift, mop squeaking against the marble, while students streamed past him in waves, debating Hale's genius. They barely noticed the janitor carrying trash bags out the side door. When they did, they laughed. "Hey, maybe you'll solve the next one, huh?" Ethan's smile was thin, but his chest burned. Every article praising Richard was a blade. He could almost feel the ink pressing into his skin, cutting deeper with each repetition. Genius, prodigy, savior. Words that should have been echoes of his own work. He told himself it didn't matter. That truth, somehow, would survive. But truth without witness was as fragile as chalk dust, wiped away with a sleeve. The more Richard rose, the more Ethan sank. One evening, he lingered outside a lecture hall. Through the glass doors, he saw Richard on stage, professors beaming around him, students clapping as though in worship. Richard smiled for the cameras, his voice steady, polished. But Ethan saw the way his eyes flickered to the side, the way his hand clutched his notes too tightly. He knew. Richard knew the crown he wore was borrowed. Still, no one else would ever believe it. That night, Ethan returned to his mirror. Equations swarmed his reflection. He pressed harder, chalk scraping against glass until it squealed. He thought of the prime numbers, silent, indivisible, stubborn. He thought of himself. A knock shattered the silence. It was his landlord, demanding rent he could not pay. Ethan handed over the little cash he had left, promising the rest after his next paycheck. The door slammed shut. Alone again, Ethan stared at his cracked mirror and whispered, "They stole it, but they can't steal what's inside." Across the city, Richard stood on a balcony overlooking Cambridge, wine in hand. Cameras had chased him all day. Professors had promised him introductions to international committees. He should have felt invincible. But when he closed his eyes, he saw a janitor's rough handwriting ghosting beneath his own elegant letters. For the first time in years, the applause did not quiet the silence. The university prepared a grand symposium to celebrate Richard's breakthrough. Invitations went out to scholars across the world. Reporters planned live coverage. Harvard was ready to crown him not just as a star student, but as the future face of mathematics. And Ethan Cole, the true hand behind the lines, polished the floor beneath the very podium where Richard Hale would soon stand. It was in that moment, while kneeling with a rag, wiping away scuff marks, that Ethan felt the absurdity press down on him. Above, banners with Richard's face fluttered in the draft. Around him, professors rehearsed speeches about genius. And he, the forgotten one, knelt in silence. But as his rag passed across the marble, Ethan whispered to himself, steady and sure, "I was there first. I know the rhythm. I will not disappear." Thus the stage was set. One boy crowned with a crown of applause, the other buried in shadows. And though the world saw only glory, deep beneath the marble of Harvard, a war of truth had begun its quiet march. The banners came first. Red banners strung across Harvard Yard, bright fabric shivering in the wind, each one stamped with the face of Richard Hale. Celebrating the breakthrough, the letters declared, bold as prophecy. Professors rehearsed speeches. Students whispered about invitations to the symposium. Cameras prowled the campus like hungry wolves. And beneath it all, Ethan Cole pushed his mop bucket, a ghost moving unnoticed in the cathedral of learning. That afternoon, sunlight slanted across the east corridor. The hall was empty, its silence broken only by the squeak of Ethan's mop and the distant murmur of a lecture down the hall. The smell of chalk dust lingered, faint but sharp. Ethan bent low, scrubbing the marble. He had learned to disappear into this silence. But today the silence cracked. Footsteps approached. echoing with a cadence Ethan already knew, confident, deliberate, too polished to belong to anyone but Richard Hale. Richard appeared, coat draped over his arm, phone at his ear. He was laughing, speaking fast. "Yes, the symposium will be historic. The Hale legacy continues, of course." Then his eyes flicked up. He saw Ethan by the board and stopped walking. The laughter drained from his voice. He lowered the phone. "Well, well," he said. "The ghost of the chalkboard." Ethan straightened, mop in hand. His voice was quiet but steady. "You stole my work." Richard's smile returned, sharp, cruel. He walked closer, slow as a predator circling prey. "Stole? No. I refined it. You wrote fragments in the dark, scribbles. I gave them a home, a stage, a crown. Without me, your chalk would still be dust on a bathroom mirror." Ethan's knuckles whitened on the mop handle. "Every line was mine. Every step. I wrote them before you even looked at that board." Richard tilted his head, feigning sympathy. "And who will believe that? The janitor, with bleach under his nails? Or me, Harvard's heir, the boy of brilliance?" His voice lowered, venom dripping. "Truth isn't truth, Cole. Truth is applause, and right now, applause belongs to me." Ethan's chest tightened. "Applause isn't proof." Richard leaned in. So close, Ethan smelled the cologne, rich and suffocating. "Proof doesn't matter. Power does. My father has lawyers who could bury you under paper until you choke. The professors adore me. The press worships me." "You?" He jabbed a finger at Ethan's chest. "You'll always be the help. A shadow sweeping someone else's brilliance off the floor." For a moment, Ethan froze. Shame burned his neck. The mop felt like a chain in his hands. But then, something shifted. His voice cracked but did not break. "One day, they'll see. One day the numbers will speak louder than you." Richard's smile widened. "Let me make this simple. Stay quiet. Keep pushing your bucket. If you whisper even a word, I'll erase you. Not just from Harvard, from Boston. You'll vanish, Cole. And the world won't even remember you existed." The corridor swallowed his words, heavy as stone. Then Richard turned, his shoes clicking against the marble, and walked away. His shadow stretched long and smug beneath the sunbeams. Ethan dropped the mop. Water spread across the floor like a dark mirror. He saw his reflection rippling, tired eyes, bent shoulders, a ghost no one would name. He bent down, touched the water, and whispered, "I am not nothing." That night, in his tiny room, Ethan pulled out his notebook. Pages lay thick with equations, each corner marked with dates, proof of long nights spent under a flickering bulb. He turned page after page, seeing his own handwriting, his own fingerprints in ink. This was his witness, his only shield. For the first time, he considered the unthinkable, showing the notebook, risking laughter, dismissal, even revenge. But at least then the truth would breathe. He pressed the notebook against his chest. Outside, Harvard roared with applause for Richard Hale. But inside, Ethan heard another rhythm, the unbending beat of prime numbers, indivisible, eternal. And he knew the war was no longer silence. The war had begun. Winter in Boston has a cruel way of tightening its grip, not with snow but with silence. The kind of silence that fills alleys where fists speak louder than words. That night, Ethan Cole walked home alone from his shift. His notebook pressed against his ribs beneath his jacket, a secret heartbeat. The streets were lined with flickering lamps, puddles of ice, and the ghosts of men with nowhere else to go. He passed a group near the corner, faces he knew from childhood, rough voices echoing against brick. One of them sneered. "The janitor, genius," he mocked, shoving Ethan's shoulder. "Think you're too good for us now?" Ethan tried to walk on. He had promised himself, no more fights, no more mistakes. But old wounds are quick to bleed. When the second shove came, something in him snapped. His fist rose before thought could stop it. The alley erupted in violence. Shouts, glass breaking, sirens far too close. Moments later, Ethan found himself slammed against a squad car, wrists locked in iron cuffs. The courtroom was no kinder. Ethan sat in chains, his uniform traded for a prison jumpsuit. The judge read out charges: assault, repeat offenses, probation violations. Ethan argued, desperate, quoting law books he had read late at night. By the Constitution, liberty is a soul's right to breathe. But the words crumbled against the gavel. Motion to dismiss is denied. Bail is set at $50,000. $50,000. It might as well have been 50 million. Ethan bowed his head, the notebook still locked in his cell, his future vanishing like chalk in rain. Meanwhile, Richard Hale sat in a leather chair across town, sipping brandy in a room of glass and gold. News of the janitor's arrest reached him quickly, faster than it reached the papers. His father's lawyers had made sure of that. Richard smiled, relief washing through him. "The problem solves itself," he murmured. With Ethan behind bars, the last shadow that could threaten his stolen crown had been erased. Days later, the world carried on. Harvard prepared for Richard's symposium. Invitations gilded with his name. Professors rehearsed the moment he would be hailed as the youngest mind to crack a century-old wall. And Ethan sat in a cell, staring at a ceiling too low, too gray. He thought of the board, of chalk dust swirling. He thought of Richard's words, "Truth is applause." He wanted to scream, but silence pressed harder than chains. Then came an unexpected visitor. The guard called his name. Ethan looked up, weary. Into the cold visiting room stepped Sean McGuire, the professor-turned-therapist who had lost his son. He set a file on the table and studied Ethan with calm, tired eyes. "I heard about the fight," Sean said. Ethan laughed bitterly. "Of course you did. Whole city must be laughing. The janitor who thought he could solve the unsolvable, back in chains where he belongs." Sean shook his head. "That's not what I see. I see a boy carrying something too heavy. A proof. A secret. A wound." Ethan's throat tightened. "It doesn't matter. He took it. Richard, His voice broke. "He stole my life." Sean leaned closer. "Then you need to decide if your life is only worth as much as what they steal, or if it's more." Outside the prison, Harvard roared with celebration. Reporters flashed cameras at Richard Hale as he walked the yard, students crowding to touch him as though he were already immortal. He waved, smile radiant, suit flawless. But in his chest, the applause rattled hollow. In every cheer, he heard the whisper of chalk, not his own. Back in his cell, Ethan lay awake. The notebook haunted him. The dates, the lines, the rhythm. Proof slept in those pages, proof that might yet breathe. He closed his eyes, whispering into the silence, "I am not nothing." The war was no longer only chalk and boards. It had become a war for his very existence, and the chains on his wrists were only the beginning. Prison doors opened, but freedom came with chains of another kind. Ethan Cole walked out of the courthouse with a thin coat against the Boston wind, no longer in handcuffs, but hardly free. The deal was clear: weekly sessions in mathematics with Professor Walker, and, worse in Ethan's eyes, mandatory meetings with a therapist. Miss one, and prison would welcome him back. Ethan had faced fists, knives, cold nights on the street. But nothing frightened him more than sitting in a room and being told to talk. The office smelled of books and coffee. Stacks of old journals leaned against the wall. A painting hung crooked above the desk, a muted seascape, waves colliding under a storm. Behind the desk sat Sean McGuire. His hair was graying at the temples, beard rough, suit jacket too worn for Harvard's polished halls. But his eyes, they carried a weight Ethan recognized. Not the weight of pride like Richard Hale's, the weight of loss. "So," Sean said softly, leaning back, "you're the janitor who broke a wall in mathematics." Ethan smirked, folding his arms. "You believe that fairy tale too?" "I believe what I see," Sean replied. "And I see a young man sitting in front of me who'd rather fight the world than let it know he's bleeding." Ethan chuckled bitterly. "Bleeding? Nah, I don't bleed. I break bones." The first session was a battlefield. Ethan mocked the books on Sean's shelf, recited quotes from psychology manuals as if he'd memorized them just to wound. "This one," he said, pointing, "claims trauma is a cage, but cages can be broken. Guess the author never grew up in Southie." Sean didn't flinch. When Ethan leaned back, arms crossed, silence thick, Sean simply watched him. When Ethan spat sarcasm, Sean let it hang in the air. Not fighting, not pushing, just waiting. And for Ethan, waiting was worse than fighting. The second session came. Ethan tried new tactics, dirty jokes, mocking Sean's painting, even insulting his late wife after noticing the ring Sean still wore. That broke the silence. Sean's eyes darkened, and for a heartbeat, Ethan thought the older man might strike him. Instead, Sean leaned close, voice steady but edged with fire. "You ever speak about my wife again, I will end this session, and you'll crawl back to prison. Understand?" The words cut deeper than fists. For the first time, Ethan looked away. Afterward, Sean sat alone in his office, staring at the seascape painting. His hands trembled. Ethan's words about his wife still echoed, cruel and raw. But beneath the pain was something else. Recognition. The boy had touched a wound because he carried one himself. Sean whispered to the empty room, "He's just a kid drowning." By the third session, the battlefield shifted. Sean suggested they meet outside in the park near the Charles River. The winter air bit at their faces, but the world felt wider there. They sat on a bench, pigeons pecking at crumbs. Ethan slouched, hands jammed in pockets, expecting another lecture. Instead, Sean said, "You think you know everything, but you've never left Boston. You can quote poets, but you've never stood in front of a painting and felt it hit you in the chest. You can solve proofs, but you've never let someone solve you. You hide behind numbers because people scare you." Ethan scoffed. "People. They're predictable. They leave. They lie. They steal." His jaw clenched. "Like hail." For the first time, Sean smiled faintly. "Ah, so you do care." Ethan blinked. He had meant to stay guarded, but the words slipped out before he could cage them. The sessions continued. Some days, Ethan said nothing at all, staring at the floor while Sean filled the silence with stories of childhood, of mistakes, of grief. Other days, Ethan cracked jokes, but Sean laughed with him instead of against him. Slowly, the fortress of sarcasm began to crumble. One evening, after a long silence, Ethan muttered, "I went on a date once. She asked about my family. I told her I had 12 brothers. Made it all up. Couldn't stand the thought of telling her the truth. that I had no one, that I was just nothing. Sean's voice was gentle. You're not nothing. You're a boy who learned to survive by hiding. But survival isn't living. Ethan swallowed hard. His throat burned, though no words came. Back in his room that night, Ethan stared at his notebook. Pages full of equations, dates, scribbles. Proof that he was something more than what Richard Hale had stolen. Yet Sean's words echoed louder than any theorem. Survival isn't living. He closed the notebook and, for the first time in years, let himself imagine, what if life could mean more than just fighting shadows? Thus, the war of silence began to shift. No longer only chalk versus applause, janitor versus rich boy. It became a war inside Ethan Cole, between the boy who hid behind numbers and the man who dared to step into the light. And Sean Maguire, with his seascape painting and steady patience, had lit the first spark. The symposium was to be grander than a coronation. Banners hung from Harvard's stone archways, red cloth gleaming in the winter light. Reporters swarmed like moths around lanterns. Scholars arrived from Cambridge, Oxford, Princeton, their coats heavy with snow, their tongues eager for revelation. They had not gathered for a king, but the air smelled of royalty all the same. At the center of it all stood Richard Hale, heir to a billion-dollar empire, crowned now not only with wealth, but with stolen genius. Inside Sanders Theater, the stage glowed with polished wood and gold lamps. Rows filled quickly, students whispering, professors adjusting spectacles, journalists setting up cameras. Backstage, Richard rehearsed his smile in the mirror. He adjusted his tie, smoothed his hair, and practiced the cadence of his opening line. What began as a curiosity on the blackboard has led us to the gates of infinity. But behind his reflection, he saw something else. Faint chalk scrawls, crude and awkward, written by a hand that smelled of bleach. For a heartbeat, his throat closed. Then he shoved the thought away. Applause waited. Meanwhile, Ethan Cole pushed a broom across the marble foyer. He had been assigned extra shifts during the symposium, as though fate itself mocked him. Students streamed past, barely noticing the janitor in gray. Every laugh, every word of excitement about Hale's discovery cut deeper. Through the glass doors, Ethan glimpsed the stage. His body ached to shout. It was me. The lines were mine. Look here, look at my notebook. His fingers brushed the worn leather in his pocket, the dates inked on every page. Proof slept there, quiet and certain. But fear coiled like a serpent. If he spoke, who would listen? The professors dazzled by Hale? The journalists already drunk on the story of a rich boy turned genius? Or the lawyers, waiting to silence him with paper and power? The lights dimmed. The crowd hushed. Richard stepped onto the stage, applause crashing like thunder. Cameras flashed. He stood tall, voice steady as he began weaving his tale of nights spent in lonely struggle, of insight drawn from years of relentless study. The crowd nodded, enthralled. Ethan stood at the back of the hall, broom frozen in his hand. He watched the thief dress himself in his skin, wearing his sweat, his solitude, his sleepless nights as if they were costumes. Rage trembled in him, so strong his knees threatened to buckle. Sean Maguire, seated in the audience, noticed Ethan. Their eyes met across the hall. Sean gave a small nod as if to say, "You are not invisible to me." Richard turned to the board behind him, chalk in hand. He retraced the very steps Ethan had first written, each symbol flowing smoother, cleaner, practiced. The crowd gasped at the elegance. Applause rippled after each line, like waves bowing to the shore. But Ethan saw what the crowd could not. The small hesitation before Richard copied the keystone step. The hesitation of someone repeating, not creating. The sound of clapping burned his ears. His heart hammered. Show them. Take out the notebook. End this masquerade. His fingers closed around the leather spine. He half pulled it from his pocket. For an instant he imagined the silence that would fall if he shouted, if he held the pages high, if he declared the truth. But then he saw Richard's father in the front row, eyes sharp, jaw set, a titan of money and influence. Around him, professors smiled, already rehearsing the articles they would publish in praise of the Hale dynasty. Fear pressed Ethan's hand back into his pocket. The notebook disappeared into shadow. The symposium ended in triumph. The crowd surged to its feet, applause rolling like storm waves. Richard bowed, his smile bright enough to blind. Reporters rushed the stage. Students swarmed him. Questions flew like sparks. Ethan slipped away unseen, broom clattering against the wall as he fled into the cold night. Outside, snowflakes drifted onto his shoulders. The world inside was roaring with a name that wasn't his. The world outside was silent, heavy, endless. He walked alone along the Charles River, breath misting in the dark. He opened the notebook at last, staring at the pages. His pages. His proof. His truth. The river whispered, "Speak. Speak before it is too late." But Ethan closed the book, clutching it tight. His heart was not ready. Back at the theater, amid champagne and celebration, Richard Hale raised a glass to his own brilliance. Cameras flashed, applause roared. But in the back of his mind, the ghost of chalk lines still scratched at him. The genius he wore was not his. And somewhere in the silence by the river, Ethan Cole whispered into the night, "I will not vanish. Not forever." Snow fell heavy over Cambridge, cloaking the yard in silence. The banners from Richard Hale's triumph still fluttered, but the frenzy had begun to fade into routine admiration. Students returned to lectures, professors returned to offices, and Harvard itself settled back into its steady heartbeat. But for Ethan Cole, the storm inside had only grown louder. He carried his notebook everywhere, tucked inside his jacket like a secret organ keeping him alive. Each page bore the same truth. Dates scribbled in the corner, rough chalk-like ink strokes, the rhythm of his mind etched long before Richard Hale ever touched the board. It was the only proof he had, and it weighed heavier than any chain. One afternoon, Ethan sat alone in the basement closet that served as his break room. He flipped through the notebook, whispering to himself as though the numbers could hear, "This was mine. I was there first. They can't take that away." But doubt crawled in. If no one ever saw it, did it matter? If the world only applauded the thief, did the truth still live? That evening, fate intervened. As Ethan scrubbed the marble steps of the science building, his notebook slipped from his pocket, tumbling to the floor. He did not notice. He was too busy watching Richard glide past with a group of admirers, laughter trailing behind him like perfume. Minutes later, a student named Clara Jennings picked up the leather-bound book. She was a mathematics major, quiet, curious, always lingering after lectures to copy down every line. She turned the first page and froze. Dates, equations. The very same proof she had watched Richard Hale present, but written weeks earlier, in handwriting too rough, too hurried to belong to him. Clara's heart raced. She flipped further. There were pages of trial and error, sketches, corrections, scribbles in the margins. Don't forget step with zeta zeros. Check distribution again. This wasn't a copy. This was creation. Clara pressed the notebook to her chest and hurried down the hall, her mind ablaze. She had idolized Hale after the symposium, dazzled by his eloquence. But now, doubt pierced through the glow. She went straight to Sean McGuire. He was in his office, the seascape painting still hanging crooked, his eyes weary but alert. "Professor McGuire," Clara said, breathless. "You need to see this." She placed the notebook on his desk. Sean opened it, eyes narrowing as he turned the pages. The dates, the raw genius bleeding through each line, the struggle and persistence no plagiarist could fake. When he looked up, his voice was hushed, almost reverent. This is Ethan's." Later that night, Sean found Ethan in the janitor's closet, slumped on a chair, staring at the floor. "You dropped something," Sean said, holding out the notebook. Ethan's eyes widened. His hand shot forward, clutching it as though Sean might steal it too. "Relax," Sean said gently. "I didn't show anyone. But Clara saw. She knows. And now, so do I." Ethan turned away, shame burning his face. "It won't matter. They won't believe me. Hale's father has the money. The professors love the story. No one listens to a janitor." Sean leaned forward, voice firm. "Then don't speak for yourself. Let the notebook speak. Truth doesn't need applause, it needs air. If you keep it locked away, you're not protecting it. You're burying it." Ethan shook his head. "If I show it, they'll laugh. Say I forged it. Or worse, they'll take it from me like he did. And then I'll have nothing left." Sean's eyes softened. "You already know what it feels like to have nothing. But this," he tapped the notebook, "this is something. It's yours. And it may be the only thing that saves you." For the first time, Ethan let someone else hold the notebook without trembling. Sean turned the pages slowly, reverently, as though each equation were a confession. "This," Sean said, "is not the handwriting of a thief. It's the handwriting of a man wrestling with infinity. The world deserves to see that. Not for applause, not for revenge, for truth." Ethan swallowed hard. The thought of stepping into the light terrified him, yet in Sean's eyes he saw no hunger for fame, no greed, no deception, only a quiet conviction that truth was worth the fight. That night, Ethan walked back to his room through the snow. The notebook pressed against his chest, heavier than ever, yet somehow lighter too. He stopped at the Charles River, its surface black and trembling under the wind. He opened the book to a page halfway through, where his handwriting faltered, crossed out 3 times before landing true. He remembered that night, the radiator hissing, his hand shaking, his reflection in the cracked mirror. Alone. Always alone. But tonight, for the first time, he did not feel entirely alone. Someone else had seen. Someone else had believed. The river whispered again. "Speak." Ethan closed the notebook, whispering back, "Not yet, but soon." And in a glass tower across town, Richard Hale raised another glass to himself, reporters still clinging to his every word. He laughed, but in the back of his mind, a chill gnawed at him, a feeling he could not shake, that somewhere, somehow, the shadow he had buried was rising. The day of the International Mathematics Colloquium dawned clear and merciless. Snow glittered on the eaves of Harvard's halls like shards of glass. Inside Sanders Theater, the air buzzed with anticipation. Journalists from New York, professors from Paris, graduate prodigies from Tokyo, all had come to witness Richard Hale present his revolution. It felt less like a lecture and more like a coronation. Ethan Cole lingered in the shadows at the back of the hall, his janitor's uniform stiff with starch, as though he could hide inside its creases. In his jacket, pressed close to his ribs, lay the notebook, his notebook. Clara had urged him to bring it. Sean had insisted. Truth must breathe, Sean had said. But now, as chandeliers glittered overhead and the crowd hushed for Hale, Ethan's courage wavered. He could already hear their laughter if he stepped forward. "The janitor thinks he wrote this?" How quaint. His hand trembled against the leather spine. Richard Hale strode onto the stage in a navy suit, his smile polished to perfection. Applause crashed like thunder. His father sat in the front row, chin lifted, eyes glinting with pride. Professors leaned forward in their seats, eager to bask in borrowed glory. Richard began smoothly. What began as a curiosity scribbled on a chalkboard has grown into a breakthrough in the study of prime distribution. Tonight, I will walk you through the journey. Journey. Ethan nearly laughed. He remembered the real journey. Mirror fogged in a rented room, nights spent erasing mistakes with a rag, hunger gnawing his stomach as numbers danced. A journey Richard had never walked. Richard turned to the board, chalk in hand. He retraced the lines, the very ones Ethan had first scratched in desperation. The crowd gasped at the elegance, applauded the symmetry. Richard paused, letting the reverence wash over him. But then came the keystone step, the one Ethan had wrestled with for weeks before it yielded. Richard hesitated, just for a heartbeat. His eyes flicked down to his notes. His hand trembled. Murmurs rippled. A professor furrowed his brow. And that was when Clara stood up. "Excuse me," her voice rang clear, young but fierce. "But those lines are not yours." The hall froze. Richard blinked, stunned. "I beg your pardon?" Clara stepped into the aisle, holding high a photocopy of a notebook page. "This proof existed weeks before you touched the board. I found it, in Ethan Cole's hand." Gasps erupted. Heads swiveled toward the back where Ethan stood pale and shaking. Richard's face flushed scarlet. "Ridiculous! A janitor writing this? You expect us to believe—" But Sean McGuire rose from his seat, sigh. His voice cut through the uproar like a blade. "I have seen the notebook myself. Dated entries, corrections, the raw struggle of creation. No plagiarist could forge that." He turned to Ethan. "Show them." The world seemed to tilt. Ethan's legs felt heavy as lead. His heart thundered. Every eye bore down on him. Professors, students, journalists, even Richard's father, whose stare burned like acid. With trembling hands, Ethan stepped forward. He drew the notebook from his jacket and placed it on the table at the foot of the stage. A hush fell as scholars leaned in. Pages turned. Dates stared back, older than Hale's performance, ink smudged by sleepless nights. Murmurs rose, swelling into outrage. "It's true. He wrote this first." "My God!" Richard's voice broke, desperate. "Lies. He could have copied it after the fact." A professor slammed a palm on the table. "Impossible. These drafts show the evolution of thought, the errors, the dead ends. This is the work of the mind that birthed the solution." He looked up, eyes blazing. "Not yours." The crown shattered. Reporters surged, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Richard's father rose, face hard as stone, and walked swiftly out, leaving his son stranded in the glare. Richard's polished mask cracked. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his hands shaking as the applause turned to accusation. The same voices that had once crowned him prodigy now spat words like daggers: fraud, thief, imposter. Ethan stood still, overwhelmed. The hall roared around him, but for him, silence reigned. He felt no triumph, no joy, only a strange, aching release. For the first time he was visible. For the first time, his shadow had a name. Sean's hand rested on his shoulder. "They see you now." Ethan's eyes burned. "I never wanted applause, just truth." "And truth," Sean said softly, "has found you." The symposium ended in chaos. Richard fled the stage, trailed by reporters like hounds. Professors clustered around Ethan, questions pouring, but he barely heard them. Clara smiled through tears, proud. Sean guided him away, out into the cold night. Snow fell again, soft and quiet. Ethan lifted his face to it, notebook clutched to his chest. For the first time, the weight felt bearable. He had not won riches, nor crowns, nor applause. But he had reclaimed his soul. The morning after the symposium, Harvard awoke in shame. Newspapers screamed headlines. Golden Boy exposed as fraud. Janitor genius stuns Harvard. The same reporters who had crowned Richard Hale a prodigy now tore his name apart. Professors whispered in corridors, embarrassed by how quickly they had believed a polished smile over the rough hand of truth. But Ethan Cole did not stay to savor their apologies. He stood alone in the janitor's closet. The smell of bleach sharp in the air, his mop propped against the wall one last time. On the shelf lay the uniform he had worn for 3 years, stained with chalk dust and loneliness. He folded it neatly, as though burying an old skin. In his hands rested the notebook. The pages were dog-eared, smudged, imperfect, yet alive. It had been his prison and his freedom, his torment and his salvation. Now it was no longer a secret. The world knew. And with that knowledge, Ethan realized, he no longer needed it to prove he existed. Outside, students gathered, some craning to see him, some whispering apologies, others too ashamed to meet his gaze. Professors offered positions, fellowships, promises of a future in academia. Journalists begged for interviews, headlines waiting to be carved. "Ethan," one professor said, voice trembling, "this is your chance. You could be the youngest name in the annals. You could have everything Hale pretended to be." Ethan looked at them, at their eager faces, and he shook his head. "I never wanted to be a name in your journals," he said quietly. "I only wanted to solve the problem." That evening, he walked across Harvard Yard with Sean McGuire. Snow crunched beneath their boots. The banners of Richard Hale still fluttered in tatters, forgotten. "You could stay," Sean said. "Build a career. Take the recognition you deserve." Ethan smiled faintly. "Recognition isn't living. You told me that." Sean chuckled. "I also told you survival isn't living, so where will you go?" Ethan stopped, looking at the horizon where the Charles River glowed faintly under the moon. "California, maybe. She's there. The girl I once pushed away. Maybe it's time I stop running." Sean's eyes softened. "Then go. And this time, don't hide." The next morning, Ethan left a letter in Sean's mailbox. It was short, written in his uneven hand. "Thank you for seeing me when no one else would. Thank you for reminding me I was not nothing. I'm leaving. Not for glory, not for numbers, but for life. You once skipped a baseball game for love. Now it's my turn. Tell them I went to see about a girl." Chuck, Ethan's oldest friend from Southie, came by his shabby apartment later that day. The door was open, the room empty. On the table sat the keys, the folded uniform, and the mop leaning against the wall. Chuck smiled, a tear rolling down his cheek. He had always dreamed of the day he'd come knock and find Ethan gone. Now that day had come. Far from Harvard, Ethan drove west in a rusted car his friends had pieced together from scrap. The road stretched endless before him, snow giving way to fields, fields giving way to desert. He carried no banners, no applause, no crown, only a heart still raw, but finally free. He rolled down the window, letting the cold wind whip his face. For the first time he felt it, the rhythm of the primes not as chains, but as music. Numbers no longer trapped him. They danced like wheat in the fields of his childhood, like stars across a sky too vast to steal. He smiled, whispering into the wind, "I am not nothing. I am alive." Back in Cambridge, the university slowly repaired its pride. Richard Hale vanished from headlines, his crown broken beyond repair. But in whispered halls and quiet offices, professors spoke of the janitor who had solved the unsolvable. Some called him a genius. Some called him a tragedy. Sean Maguire, standing before his crooked seascape painting, simply called him a boy who had finally chosen to live. And somewhere down a sunlit highway, with California drawing near, Ethan Cole carried no title but his own name. That, at last, was enough. Dear friends, if Ethan's story touched your heart, if you believe that truth and hope can rise even from the shadows, then we invite you to journey with us. Every story we tell carries a spark of light for someone out there, maybe for you, maybe for the person you love. Please subscribe, leave us a comment, and share this story with a friend. Your voice, your presence, means more than you know. Thank you, from the bottom of our hearts, for being part of this journey.